Open Objectivism. Objectivism is the philosophy founded by the novelist philosopher Ayn Rand. The philosophy is naturalistic in its metaphysics, it's pro-reason, pro-empirical reason in its theory of knowledge. It sees human beings as body-mind integrates with volitional agency. It has a pursuit of happiness, rational self-interest ethic, and a liberty as fundamental politics, holding that individuals should be free in all areas of their lives: intellectual, economic, political, aesthetic, sexual, and romantic, with a strictly limited government to protect their individual rights. One of the important internal debates within Objectivism has been over its nature as a philosophy. Is it an open system or a closed one? Rand died in 1982, and within a decade of her death, objectivists began debating this, the issue touching on profound fundamentals about the nature of philosophy in general and objectivism in particular. I was invited to debate the issue publicly by the Ayn Rand Center Europe at its conference held in Belgrade, Serbia in April of 2023. A video of the full debate is available online, as is an unedited transcript of my remarks, but I also wanted to produce this audio version. So here it goes. Introduction: Benevolence. I'll start by saying that it's always a pleasure to meet other people who are passionate about ideas, who are interested in philosophy in particular, and who are at some level excited about Ayn Rand. It is a rare and a special thing. So I wanted to start by flagging this concept, the concept of benevolence. When you're doing philosophy, and you're doing philosophy particularly with people who share important values with you in the fight for liberty, and Ayn Rand's philosophy in particular, that is a special thing. It says something special and wonderful about a person that they've responded well, positively, or strongly to something in Ayn Rand's philosophy. When we're doing philosophy, reality is very complicated. Philosophy is difficult. It's difficult intellectually, and it's difficult emotionally because it pushes deep buttons in us. And when disagreements occur, and they will occur, it's part of the business of doing philosophy, always to remember the benevolence point. You're doing philosophy with someone who likes, respects, or even loves Ayn Rand. Keep that as a governing part of your thinking about how you're doing the debates. Objectivism as a philosophy and philosophy as science. Now, what is objectivism? My first proposition is going to be this one. Objectivism is a science. Now, this is a controversial claim within philosophy, but Ayn Rand and objectivism are very clear about taking a firm stance and positioning objectivism as a certain way of thinking, as a scientific way of thinking. Here's a direct quotation from Rand on this. Quote, "Epistemology is a science devoted to the discovery of the proper methods of acquiring and validating knowledge. Ethics is a science devoted to the discovery of the proper methods of living one's life. Medicine is a science devoted to the discovery of the proper methods of curing disease." The quote carries on, but I will end it there. Now, the source for this is Ayn Rand's Concepts of Consciousness article in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. Now, you'll notice that the concept of science is emphasized and repeated. And ethics and epistemology are two of the 4 or 5, depending on your categorization, of core philosophical areas. But it's the same thing about doing metaphysics, about our understanding of human nature, the proper principles of politics, how art pushes our buttons psychologically and morally as well. Philosophy, according to objectivism, is conceived of as a science, and Rand is saying that we need to think very seriously when we are doing philosophy about what it is to be a scientist. Now, Science is about discovering truths about reality. So there's always a content, but there's also an entire methodological process that one engages in. Observation, categorization, conceptualization, forming definitions, coming up with hypotheses, doing experiments, and the whole gamut of logical methodologies as well. All of that is built into science. There are also character issues when you are functioning as a scientist. What is it to think and behave as a scientist would? To be a philosopher is to be a scientist. Philosophy is a subset of science. Now, I'm hitting on this science point hard. It's my first big emphasis as a key question for objectivists. Science contrasted to art. Now, Rand is complicated because in addition to being a philosopher, she's also an artist. Art and science are related to each other, but also distinct in very important ways. Art is a personal creation by an individual. It brings something into existence that did not exist before and that would not have existed except for the unique contributions of the individual who created it. Science is different. Science is not about making stuff up and your individual creativity. Science is about what is out there, and identifying it is, in that sense, in the public domain. When we are doing science, we are both in the same reality and trying to identify the same reality. And your personal creativity and my personal creativity are to the side. So science is about objective reality and identifying it, while art is about individual creations. Now, art, of course, will embody, at least implicitly, sometimes explicitly, understandings of reality. Now, why is this distinction important? Well, here's a quotation that's relevant to notice from Ayn Rand's article on patents and copyrights. Quote, "It is important to note in this connection that a discovery cannot be patented, only an invention. A scientific or philosophical discovery which identifies a law of nature, a principle or a fact of reality not previously known, cannot be the exclusive property of the discoverer, because A, he did not create it, and the quotation carries on, but I will end here. So I'm pausing here. Rand is emphasizing that objectivism is a philosophy and philosophy is a science. It is about discovery. It is not about things that we are creating, and it is not owned by the discoverer. Now, carrying on this long and important quotation from Rand, quote, "And B, if he cares to make his discovery public, claiming it to be true, he cannot demand that men continue to pursue or practice falsehoods except by his permission. He can copyright the book in which he presents his discovery, and he can demand that his authorship of the discovery be acknowledged, that no other man appropriate or plagiarize the credit for it, but he cannot copyright theoretical knowledge," unquote. Now, the source for this is Ayn Rand's article, Patents and Copyrights in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So, philosophy/science as theoretical knowledge is not owned. It is discovered. It cannot be copyrighted, patented, and so forth. Now, what I'm suggesting is that we have to think of Ayn Rand in two ways. They are related, but Rand is a scientist and Rand is an artist. How we think about objectivism as Rand's philosophy should be the same way we think about Newton and his physics, or the way we think about Darwin and his evolutionary theory, or Einstein and his physical theory. And in contrast, the way we think about artists and their personal creations, Michelangelo and his sculptures, Beethoven and his music, Monet and his paintings, Rand and her fiction. You don't add notes to Beethoven's score. And you don't take notes away from Beethoven's score. You don't take a Monet painting and add your own daubs and say, I think the color scheme should be changed. And you don't say, I don't like this bit over here, I'm going to paint over that. The artwork is inviolable. It is the personal creation of the artist. You do not alter it, change it, subtract from it, or add to it. But that is not the case with science. With science is precisely about identification of facts that are independent of the scientist. And it is, I don't want to use the word quite yet, an ongoing process of discovery and reintegrations when new discoveries are made. So don't touch Rand's artwork, the philosophy we now turn to.
You're listening to Open College on the Possibly Correct Network with renowned philosopher and author Dr. Stephen Hicks. A podcast to explain the chaos, taking an in-depth look into how postmodernism is affecting the modern world and your lives without you even realizing it. Stay up to date with the latest releases and news from Dr. Hicks by following the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Minds.com and Gab, or sign up to our email list at www.opencollegepodcast.com. While you're online, please show your support for the podcast by leaving a review on your chosen media player. Now back to the podcast.
Open and closed as metaphors. Now, our central question in this debate is open or closed. Those words get used a lot. Now, the first thing to note, though, is that they're metaphors. They're a figure of speech. Doors can be open, doors can be closed, windows can be open, windows can be closed. What metaphorically are we trying to get to when we talk about an abstract theoretical set of ideas that it's open or closed? So the first thing that we have to do when we're doing philosophy and good science is to notice when we are using metaphors and to take the extra efforts to take the metaphors or any figure of speech and to put them in direct, literal language. And so defining exactly what this figure of speech is trying to capture in non-metaphorical language. Now, I'm going to suggest that there are three important things built into the way any theoretical science, including philosophy and including objectivism, in which the words open and closed are used. Now, there's a long history in the sciences of this terminology being used, so we can draw upon that and apply it to objectivism as well. One way in which we might say a system of ideas is closed or open is by answering this question: is it complete? That is to say, whatever domain we're talking about in our science, that all of the questions have been answered. All of the things that need to be known in that domain are known. So we don't need to add any more questions or add any more content. It is complete in that sense. Now, to throw out an arbitrary number, suppose we say in philosophy there are 5 branches, and then here's the arbitrary part. Then in each part of philosophy, each branch, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and so on, there are 8 or 10 or 20 important questions in that branch of philosophy. And suppose then collectively that means that in all philosophy, if you're going to have a complete philosophy, you need to address, say, 100 issues. Then the question for objectivism is, on those 100 important issues that would make objectivism a complete philosophy, did Ayn Rand address all 100 of them? And not only that, did she state a position on 100 of them? Not only that, did she make an argument for each of those positions? And did she make the argument in a thorough fashion up to whatever level of scholarly discourse you think is appropriate? Now here, what I want to suggest is that the answer to that question should be no. Rand did a lot. She did an enormous amount of important, fundamental stuff. And she had positions on a majority of those 100 questions that a complete philosophy has to answer. But she didn't do all of them. She wrote one book on epistemology, and she called it an introduction to objectivist epistemology, making it clear that there's lots more that needs to be said about epistemology beyond this introduction. So it's not complete in that sense. It's also, with respect to completeness, not enough to say, here are the 100 positions that the philosopher announces what his, or in this case, her conclusions are. The philosopher must develop arguments for them. So we have 100 positions plus 100 arguments. Now we know in Rand's case, on a significant number of issues, she would tell you what her position is, but she did not develop the arguments for that position. And that means there is still work to be done. Sometimes she would give us the conclusion, but not the argument. And sometimes she goes also the other way. Interestingly, she will say, here's the fact, here's the facts, here's a fact, and then you, dear reader, you can see where this is going, or you can see what the implication of this, but she doesn't state the implication explicitly. And that means there's still work to be done and filling in that implication. And that then is going to be an interpretive move for philosophers to engage. All right, so on that first question, the question of completeness, I think that's actually the easier question. 2, I think this is the harder question for open or closed. Not only is it complete, but is it correct? Is it true? Is it perfect in that sense? Of all the things that Rand said as the founder of this philosophy, did she get everything right? Now, sometimes that's a hard question for people to put explicitly and to engage with. But if we are going to be serious philosophers, serious scientists, we must go through all the important propositions that she makes and say, do I think this is true? Do I think it could be stated more precisely? If, for example, she is making a claim in epistemology that bears on some elements of cognitive psychology, well, have we learned anything in cognitive psychology since Rand died that might suggest that we can revise or tweak this or that? Are all of her terms defined at a suitable level of precision? Sometimes she defined a term for a general audience, but in a more technical context, she didn't give you the precise technical definition, and that, of course, would need to be articulated. And then, of course, the big thing would be, are there cases where I think Rand has made a mistake? Now, it could be a mistake that feeds into one of her premises, or I could think that she's engaged in a chain of logic. One of the powers of her brilliance is the long chains of logic, the huge amounts of historical and psychological and other philosophical and scientific data that she has integrated, that every single logical connection in all of those arguments is perfect. And not only that, if we say a complete philosophy, suppose we satisfy the completeness criteria and every individual position is defined perfectly and the argument is made for it perfectly. There still is the matter of taking all 100 of those elements and integrating them into a system. If we want to say objectivism is a systematic philosophy, the amount of work to integrate 100 propositions, now again, 100 is a somewhat arbitrary number here, but whatever the number is, to integrate them completely and perfectly, that is an enormous amount of work. And our question is, did Rand accomplish that? Now, those two senses of open and closed, as complete and as perfect, are ones that all of us as individual philosophers, individual thinkers, individual scientists, emphasizing that context, do for ourselves. But it's also the case that we do philosophy in a public mode as well. It can be, intimate one-on-one discussions or small group discussions. Sometimes it's doing formal courses in philosophy where one is a teacher with respect to students. Sometimes it's a matter of forming organizations and institutions around a certain set of ideas because we want to advocate those ideas out there in the world. So when we're doing philosophy in a social context, the question of open or closed also is relevant. 3. So here are the initial questions here. Is one open to all of the above questions in discussion? Or is it the case, the different side would be, I'm not interested in discussion. I have my views, and I am one-way street with respect to communication. Are you open to being questioned? Or do you make it clear from the beginning that certain things cannot be questioned, closed? Are you open to being not religiously dogmatic, but actually challenged by people who think they disagree with you? And that, of course, is going to happen. If you have smart young people trying to do philosophy, then they will have hundreds and hundreds of questions. What is your attitude with respect to those hundreds of questions? Are you open to the idea that you can be wrong? And should the arguments go against you, are you actually willing to change your mind? That is what a scientist will do. That is what a good philosopher will do. And then, more formally, as we're trying to do here today in this debate, are you open to debate, which is a very public and stylized way of contesting ideas, contrasting ideas, important ideas, and so forth. Also, all of that is just to speak from your perspective, because all social things involve at least two people. But open, are you open to the other person with whom you are doing the philosophy, going through this process, this very difficult process of scientific philosophy? The other person asking all of these questions and coming up with weird ideas and challenging and so forth, and recognizing because of the difficulty of philosophy and life that they have to go through the process, that they're not going to get it completely and perfectly the first time, that it's going to be an iterative process, and that your part in that social relationship is to foster in a healthy and benevolent way that process of doing philosophy to whatever ideal standard you want to achieve. Now, in that social context, a couple more sub-questions arise. Suppose you're going through this process, you're doing philosophy and it's really hard, and you're in a movement, though, when you are younger, and you recognize that others in the movement have credentials, PhDs. One aspect of this openness then has to do with how should that relationship go? Now, I actually am one of those objectivist philosophers with a PhD, so suppose that you and I are doing some philosophy and you disagree with me. How should that go? How should I relate to you in that disagreement, and how should you relate to me in that disagreement? And then to raise the stakes even a little further, what if your thinking, when you're going through the process, disagrees with something Ayn Rand says? You're thinking that maybe this definition could be more precisely focused, or given some new insights from neuroscience or whatever. You think that we need to rethink objectivist epistemology, say measurement omission, and Rand's particular hypothesis about that. So to say, wow, perhaps I'm disagreeing with Ayn Rand on this issue. Are you open to going through that process? That's the challenge.
Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for his statement that God is dead, and his provocative account of master and slave moralities, and also for the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis claimed that Nietzsche was one of their great inspirations. Were the Nazis right to do so, or did they misappropriate Nietzsche's philosophy? Professor Stephen Hicks's concisely written book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, based on the 2006 documentary, corrects many widespread misconceptions about Nietzsche, giving a fascinating and easy-to-understand analysis of Nietzsche's work, asking and answering a number of questions, such as what were the key elements of Hitler and the National Socialist political philosophy? How did the Nazis come to power in a nation as educated and civilized as Germany? What was Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy? The philosophy of live dangerously, and that which does not kill us makes us stronger? And to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy provide a foundation for the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis? Professor Hicks demonstrates his mastery of this subject using quotes and critical analysis that prove his points and show the true linkage between Nietzsche and the Nazis, and how philosophical ideas move the world. Get your copy of Nietzsche and the Nazis by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com today. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast hosted by Hicks himself on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Who is the final authority in philosophy? Now, Rand's answer to this question is in an essay she wrote called "Who is the Final Authority in Ethics?" And here's a quotation from it. Quote, "Metaphysically, the only authority is reality, epistemologically, one's own mind. The first is the ultimate arbiter of the second. The concept of objectivity contains the reason why the question, who decides what is right and wrong, is wrong." Now, pausing there on the quotation. So when there is disagreement between people who are more or less peers, or between people who are in kind of different ranks in a hierarchy or some social organization, PhDs, founders, students, and so on, metaphysically, the only authority is reality. There is no authority except for the world, reality, and epistemologically, one's own mind. So it's not the objectivist PhD's mind that is the authority. It's not Ayn Rand's mind that's the authority. It's your mind in connection with reality. That is the central thesis of objectivism with a capital O. That's the fundamental. Now Rand continues the quotation here. The answer here, as in all other moral intellectual problems, is that nobody decides. Reason and reality are the only valid criteria. Who determines which theory is true? Any man who can prove it. And she has that italicized. Any man who can prove it. And then she goes on to say, this prevents the formation of any coercive elite in any profession, unquote. Now, the source of that is Rand's article, Who is the Final Authority in Ethics? It was first in the Objectivist newsletter from February 1965. So finally, on this issue of elites, of course, Rand, is a little worried at this point, writing in the 1960s. She knows the often terrible history of what happens to philosophical and scientific, not even to mention religious and other systems that go on to form social movements. The formation of elites that stopped being open, stopped being philosophers, stopped being scientists in the proper sense. And you'll notice that she used the phrase coercive elite in any profession. She's not talking about political coercion. She's talking about all of the hard and soft versions of coercion which can happen in any social movement. There's no tolerance for that in objectivism. Objectivism is your mind in connection to reality. Only do that. How best to advance objectivism? Now, if these are our social questions, well, how do we best then protect and advance objectivism? Well, we know what it means to be an objectivist. If you think of the argument I have made more personally about the immense value and significance of Ayn Rand in your life, given the nature of her just astonishing accomplishments, it is proper to want to revere the amazing human beings who appear in our midst once in a while. How do you do that? Well, you do not do it by turning her into a god or a demigod or anything close to that. She, Ayn Rand, is encouraging you to question, to challenge, to debate, even her, and you have to step up to that task. Now, a quick closing point. I want to say that there's a lot of water under the bridge, and I hope it can stay under the bridge, and this is particularly for the young people in the movement here. To advance objectivism and to revere Ayn Rand properly, the first thing I would say is forget the history of the movement. Just block it out of your mind entirely. There's a huge amount of intellectual energy, emotional energy that you have. Don't get yourself sucked into all of the debates and arguments and personality conflicts that have gone on for the last 30, 40, 50 years or so. It will waste all of your energy. You have your mind, and you have Rand's works to start with and build upon. And of course, there are other good philosophers you can learn from them. Learn from them. But focus on the future. Start over and create the world that you think is possible. That's what it is to be a good objectivist.
You are listening to Open College with Dr. Stephen Hicks. Follow Open College on X, Facebook, and on Substack at opencollegepodcast.substack.com. You can also follow Dr. Stephen Hicks on X at SRC Hicks and Open College Pod. Please leave a review in your podcast player and like, share, and subscribe to Open College.